There's this aesthetic. I'm sure you've seen it. A gridded landscape, sports cars, palm trees, skyscrapers, cyan, magenta, neon, and of course, that giant orange setting sun segmented into smaller and smaller pieces. Maybe you saw it in a music video, album cover, movie poster, tattoo, t-shirt, phone wallpaper, comedy special, video game, movie, somewhere. But you've seen it. It's insanely popular and has been for the last 10 years or so. I know what you're thinking. This is not 80s. It's Outrun. Outrun is an aesthetic born first and foremost out of 80s retrofuturism. Yes, we're using big words today. Retrofuturism, as the name implies, is an aesthetic in which media of the past, retro, attempts to depict the world of the future. Think the Jetsons, Fallout, or anything steampunk. Let me be clear. Retrofuturism is typically a very optimistic genre. From what I've observed, retrofuturism always hinges on the emerging technology of that era in the hypothetical future where it ends up solving all our problems. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was the steam engine. In the 50s, it was nuclear power. And in the 80s, it was computers. Outrun is understood as a modern aesthetic, so nothing from the 80s itself can actually be considered Outrun. True Outrun is an entirely separate visual style that takes heavy inspiration from 80s media and pop culture, but done through a retrospective lens. That's an important distinction, and if it sounds confusing, that's because it is, for reasons I'll talk about later. But for right now, let's actually define what constitutes an Outrun piece. Now, I'm not someone who's existed within the space for a while, nor did I grow up in the decade these visuals debuted in, but I have spent the last 3 months reading every website, article, and Reddit post about this specific style. And while there are a ton of conflicting opinions on what is and isn't Outrun, I found some solid through lines. Rule number 1, Outrun is a visual aesthetic only. Any music I've seen described as Outrun is really just synthwave. Okay, now what is synthwave? I'll get there, okay? All you need to know right now is that it's synth music specifically inspired by 80s soundtracks and instrumentals. But Outrun, that is visual only. Unlike goth or vaporwave, which has both an aesthetic and musical style under the same name, Outrun is only the visual half. Think of pixel art and chiptune. Sure, they're often linked together, but chiptune is solely musical style, and pixel art is pixelated artwork. Am I maybe being a little pedantic? Yes. But the sun is going to blow up in 5 billion years. All words are made up anyways. Let me do this, okay? Rule number 2. Outrun contains a couple visual constants you'll see throughout most pieces of its work. The most common of which being bright neon over a dark background. This might be the single most common thing you see in Outrun works, but I've seen exceptions to even that. And if you so much as existed, you'll have seen the iconic Outrun sun, denoted by the horizontal gaps and blood orange gradient. It doesn't have an official name, so I'll be calling it the Run Sun for the rest of the video, and you cannot do anything to stop me. When there is a Run Sun, it's always center screen, which highlights another common Outrun trope: symmetry. Symmetry. I'm not saying if it's not symmetrical, it's not Outrun, but there's definitely a trend in the genre to draw the eye towards the middle column of the frame. Also, since the Run Sun is most commonly rising over a central horizon, nobody better show this shit to John Ford, okay?
When the horizon's in the middle, it's boring as shit.
Well, he's dead, so that makes it easier. Anyways, what makes up that horizon is, in my opinion, the single most iconic piece of Outrun media: the grid. Maybe the most common visual motif behind black and neon. I mean, what more can I say? It speaks for itself. 3-dimensional, infinite, eye-catching, ever-present. But on that grid lies our third and most common piece of Outrun iconography: coastal America. Outrun is rarely complete without palm trees, skylines, or most commonly, sports cars. Not just any sports cars, 80s sports cars. And also the DeLorean. But with these 3 pillars, we have the triangle that makes up Outrun. Also triangles. They're in Outrun sometimes too. No one knows why. Rule number 3. There really are no rules. The fascinating thing about aesthetics like Outrun is how they can kind of seep into all different forms of media. For the sake of this video, I've been defining it as a purely visual form of expression like stills or video. Obviously, with something as arbitrary as genre, it's really up to the individual to decide, but this is the hill I have chosen to die on. Now, This poses a larger question of how the hell did we get here? These elements may be from the 80s, but why? Where did Outrun come from? For the answer to that question, we need to go all the way back to 1986, where Sega would release one of the biggest arcade titles of the decade, a driving game where the player controls a Ferrari Testarossa driving down an endless stretch of road adorned with palm trees. This game? The gameplay boils down to reaching the end of the stage as quickly as possible by way of essentially just reckless driving. Top Score Newsletter called it the most enjoyable and realistic driving video game ever created, and it's credited for reviving Sega's arcade sales in the 80s. It also won Game of the Year by the Golden Joystick in 1987, a title later to be shared with the likes of Elden Ring, Mario 64, Skyrim, and other games you've heard way too much about. While Outrun itself doesn't really garner much online discussion these days, its lasting influence most certainly does, laying the groundwork for Outrun as we know it today. While Sega's Outrun might be missing a lot of key Outrun iconography like the grid, the run sun, or the neon, the composition is all there. Symmetrical framing, an endless horizon, and dope-ass cars. But it did far more than help establish a niche internet aesthetic. Outrun is considered by many as one of the most influential games of all time. And I haven't even talked about the soundtrack. Outrun gave extra significance to its music by starting the game with offering the player their choice of music, not unlike GTA 5's radio system 27 years later. It's not a crazy innovation by any means, but it did establish a unique connection between the game and music, something we see today with modern Outrun and Synthwave. Wired writer Jacobo Prisco says Outrun's influences still being felt on consoles, in music, and in movies, citing its influence on games like Gran Turismo, Need for Speed, and Forza Horizon. Outrun was a major inspiration for this Outrun, no doubt about it. But it's just a piece of a much larger puzzle. Hell, it's not the only one with cars in it. Initial D did a lot for the space, coming out in the 90s depicting the boom of Japanese street racing in the 1980s. You could see its influence on lots of Outrun imagery, meshing well with the tight roads, dark palette, and coastal urban lifestyle. Now, as for the Run Sun, we can trace that one all the way back to the 70s. That being the general idea of breaking up a single shape into multiple sized pieces. You can see the resemblances in all sorts of media from that era. I haven't been able to find a singular use of a setting sun with these lines that I can point to as the definitive proto-Run Sun, but if I had to guess, the two oldest examples of this type of style are probably the original Comfort Inn logo from 1982 to 2004, and the award-winning California license plate from 1982 to 1987. I had no idea they gave awards for stuff like that, but go off, I guess. But there was something about the grid that gripped the 1980s like nothing else ever could. In the 1980s, the laser grid represented progress. It represented the potential of the personal computer in the beginning of the digital age. We can see it in media as early as the late 60s in sci-fi movies like 2001, where futuristic computers used wireframe vectors to create primitive shapes. This visual persisted throughout the 70s, and then The Black Hole came out in 79, using the full laser grid for both its trailer and opening sequence. Tron followed in 82, and what made these movies revolutionary was that they treated the grid as a whole new setting, no longer framed within a computer screen. Arcade games were already doing that at this point, and with the two combined, the laser grid became a fairly mainstream design element in the 80s, at least within the tech space. Like, you wouldn't see Wonder Bread with a laser grid on it. You would see it behind a submachine gun though, because why not? It's the 80s. We're crazy. We got cars made out of refrigerators and holes in the ozone layer. Truly an iconic time. And just about any piece of 80s iconography can make its way into Outrun. In my totally arbitrary judgment system though, unless any one of these three are present, I do not consider it Outrun. Why? Because there's not a consistency like these three have. Now, you could show me pictures like this, or these, or all of these, which don't have any of these qualities but still feel like Outrun. Okay, so I admit my system isn't perfect, and it's hard to keep a grip on this slippery fish covered in oil we call the Outrun aesthetic. But the best I can do is look at the patterns and draw my conclusions from there, because I have to draw a line somewhere. Otherwise, anything with a steering wheel could be called Outrun. We're going off of science, not vibes. Exactly how art was meant to be enjoyed. Okay, now, to answer the final scientific question, how did we get from then to now? Because I presented all the pieces, but somewhere between 1980 and 2023 did people begin to put them all together. Somewhere in the last 40 years, Outrun as we know it today was born. So who was it? Who took all these 80s pop icons and fused them together into what we call today Outrun? How did it evolve into the modern day? Outrun as an aesthetic reached its heyday back in 2014, 2015-ish, thanks in part to the 80s nostalgia wave, aka that period where 80s throwback products were seemingly everywhere because companies realized that demographic had a disposable income now. This came in tandem with the increased popularity of Synthwave, and Outrun kind of rode its coattails via album covers and music videos. At the end of the 2000s, artists like Gunship, Kavinsky, Time Cop, and Valerie Collective were pioneering the genre and cementing Synthwave as its own new thing. Before that, Synthwave was more of a subsect of EDM sequestered to the French electronic music scene, since America was so sick of synths after the 80s. But then, in 2011, one movie released. A movie which represented a dark coastal America set to a synth soundtrack featuring a runaway hit from French synthwave artist and pioneer Kavinsky. It was the perfect storm. It was Film District's 2011 Drive follows an unnamed character simply called the Driver, played by our GOAT, Ryan Gosling, getaway driver by night, mechanic and part-time stunt driver by day. It's a very simple plot, inspired by old Hollywood, even taking place in Los Angeles. Director Nicholas Winding Refn is quoted saying he chose the satin jacket specifically to invoke that knight in shining armor imagery, complete with an insignia and all. It's a very romantic movie, both in style and substance, despite all the violence and organized crime that surrounds it. There's a reason why it holds cultural significance. Drive is a very good movie, but I don't think anyone really expected it to do well. For one, they couldn't even get the lead actor and director in its own behind-the-scenes featurette. Nicholas Winding Refn was a relative unknown at the time, and he'd done things like the Pusher trilogy, a series I'm sure you've never heard of, but it was a big deal for the Norwegian mob movie genre, as in it created the Norwegian mob movie genre. How did Danish filmmaker Nicholas Winding Refn end up directing an American crime movie set in LA? Ryan Gosling, actually. Anyways, it made 5 times its budget in the box office and propelled Refn's career, which he immediately fumbled with Only God Forgives. But more importantly, Drive's runaway success extended to the songs it features, most notably Kavinsky's Night Call, an early synthwave banger that plays in the movie's opening credits. Night Call was produced by both Kavinsky and one half of Daft Punk, Guy Manuel de Omam Cristo, who makes up the Daft part, I think. Night Call was synthwave before the term was ever actually coined. For a genre meant to evoke the American 1980s, I don't know if you've noticed, but synthwave's roots are very French. After being featured in Drive, Kavinsky embraced the popularity, and not long after, he released a full synthwave album in the same vein of Night Call, even including it in the track list. That album is called Outrun. But after that, Kavinsky went dormant and didn't release any new music for the rest of the decade. Coincidence or not, following Night Call, more synthwave artists came out from the woodwork, like Gunship with their debut album. But what we care about are the album covers. Gunship's debut uses what may be the first contemporary rendition of the Run Sun over the laser grid. But before that, DAD's 2013 synthwave album The Construct features a moon over a gridded landscape, and before that, the Foundation's 2007 synthwave album The Departure features a lined landscape with a guy over it. Okay, yeah, so it's pretty hard to pinpoint where or when exactly the modern Outrun aesthetic emerged. It just kind of slowly developed. Besides the synthwave scene, Outrun made its way into video games, and pretty heavily at that, in the interesting full circle kind of way. Inspired by the themes and visuals of Drive, combined with that 80s retro-futuristic arcade look, came the hyper-violent top-down shooter Hotline Miami, released by Devolver Digital in 2012, just over a year after Drive. In Hotline Miami, you play as Jacket, an unnamed protagonist who goes on crime sprees at night in coastal America. He lives in a shitty apartment, gets wrapped up in mob business, and is easily identifiable by his jacket and symbolic animal attire. Like I said, very inspired. In each level, you play as Jacket going on brutal killing sprees from floor to floor over a thumping synthwave EDM soundtrack. Just like Drive, the indie project exploded in popularity, once again in part due to its use of nostalgic imagery. But as you could probably tell, Hotline Miami is much more upfront about its retro inspirations, even taking place in the 80s this time. The game won a couple awards, was nominated for way more, but in my opinion, Hotline Miami's true achievement is its test to time. Since its release over a decade now, Hotline Miami is still heralded as one of the greatest video games of all time, with a very tangible, lasting impact on the gaming industry. Its 2015 sequel, Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number, a title with nearly double the amount of syllables as its predecessor, is a bit more divisive, due in part to its web of characters and plot lines, which are told completely out of order. The Outrun style is still present, of course, but takes more of a backseat to make room for a behemoth of a story. Coming out in 2013, Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon evokes a lot of Outrun imagery, though it's trying its hardest to evoke as much 80s energy as possible. This over-the-top parody style of 80s throwback was also pretty common around this time, since the 80s are very easy to make fun of. Outrun, being the opposite of subtle, fits nicely into that style, which culminated in the movie Kung Fury, coming out in 2015. And before we can talk about that, I need to talk about 2015. It was a big year for Outrun. Gunship's debut album released, along with Timecop 1983's second album. Highlight Maybe 2 Wrong Number came out this year as well, and of course, so did Kung Fury. In Pixels. We were beginning to reach this event horizon for contemporary 80s media, where more and more was being dug back up for nostalgia and throwbacks. But there is a finite amount of 80s. There's only so much you can throw back. Kung Fury marked this turning point well by taking just about every 80s trope under the sun and jam-packing them together into this ridiculous 30-minute cinematic post. It's a great movie, don't get me wrong, but it starts to feel like beating a dead horse. Then, as if the market wasn't oversaturated enough, perhaps the biggest, most expensive piece of 80s throwback ever was released. Star Wars: The Force Awakens. Now, let's not kid ourselves. The movie is a reimagining of the original Star Wars. It doesn't have the neon grids or synthwave beats, but The Force Awakens is still very much in line with the 80s throwback movement of the early 2010s. The movie was a smash hit, but with it came fatigue. The following year came Stranger Things, which is debatably even more of a nostalgia kick, but from 2016 onward, we begin to see less and less 80s nostalgia being made, and subsequently Outrun along with it. It's faded from a mainstream fad down to a passive aesthetic you'll see on merchandise or wallpapers. Synthwave's heyday is over too, developing into a watery sludge of samey ambient tracks, much like lo-fi hip-hop is now. But Synthwave also fractured into like a billion microgenres, ranging from dark synth to dreamwave to synth pop and sex wave and fast wave. That's a topic for another day. But the popularity of Outrun has fizzled away once people realized it was basically a one-trick pony. Wow, the 80s, cool, so retro. Fast forward to 2023. That ship has sailed. Outrun is a thing of the past, which interestingly enough raises some weird questions. See, Outrun as a visual style is a modern audience's interpretation of 80s retrofuturism. And from what we've seen, this interpretation isn't far from the source material. So give it some time to marinate, fade into the noise. And now it's no longer a trend of the early 2010s. Now you look at these pieces and you think 80s. At least Google does. 80s retro, 80s techno, 80s aesthetic, all Outrun. Once again, I will make myself crystal clear. This is not 80s. It is not from the 80s. It did not exist during the 1980s. The prolonged existence of Outrun in the modern internet era has seriously muddied the waters between what we think were the 80s versus what actually were the 80s. Does this mean that the existence of Outrun, a silly little mood board aesthetic, is going to actually erase history? That this is the result of some greater plot, a grand scheme bent on ensuring that people have no idea what the 1980s were actually like? No, of course not. I don't even know what they were really like. If anything, this is just a common misconception, okay, an accident. But I would be lying if I said it didn't worry me. Confusion over which decade put a sun with lines over a grid is beyond trivial, just completely harmless. However, what we see in Outrun's popularity and subsequent misunderstanding is, essentially, an accidental rewrite in history. Something that happens all the time to things way more important, and we rarely even know it. You might be thinking this is historical revisionism. Not really. With the sheer volume of human history that is only increasing, it makes sense that, over time, historians might reinterpret previous works or find new data altogether. Historical revisionism on the whole is a very normal thing used by academics and scholars to keep our view of the past accurate based on current data. This is not what we're dealing with. This is historical negationism, the act of rewriting or altering history in ways that directly conflict with concrete factual data. This is where misinformation really runs amok. The Mandela effect is a good place to start. The collective misremembrance of history. The effect was coined after many people reported remembering Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s when he actually died in 2013. It's also about stupid shit like the Fruit of the Loom logo, what Darth Vader said at Empire Strikes Back, and whether the Monopoly Man had a monocle or not. All this is beyond trivial, but if somebody believes it's true and shares it with others, those others now walk away believing in false information. History has now been negated. So throw the internet into the mix, separating people from people, ideas from reality, and actions from consequences. On the internet, it's just as easy to share a meme as it is to deny the Holocaust. Negationist ideologies include things like the Civil War being about states' rights rather than slavery, Turkey's denial of the Armenian genocide, China's denial of the Tiananmen Square massacre, the claim that certain elections were rigged. All of these things have had real lasting impacts on how people today live their lives, and failure to acknowledge the truth leads to, at best, injustice, and at worst, a repeat of these historical atrocities and attitudes such as bigotry. Okay, usually it's bigotry. Most people don't intend to spread misinformation, but rather spread ideology. We like to think we only share things with others if we believe it's true, but in reality, there is a pretty big disconnect between why we share things and whether we actually believe them. In fact, according to a study at MIT, whether or not a headline is politically concordant had a significantly larger effect on sharing intentions than whether the headline was true or false. During the experiment, for example, researchers showed participants the headline, "Over 500 migrant caravanners arrested with suicide vests." While only 15.7% of the Republicans in the study said they thought it was true, 51.1% said they would consider sharing it to other people. Over the entire study, participants were twice as likely to share these false but politically consistent headlines than they were to rate the same headlines as accurate. At the same time, when asked if the truth of information shared was important, the general consensus was extremely important. Various other experiments were referenced in the study with similar results. We like to believe we only strive for what is the truth, but when it comes down to facts, that is not the case at all. What we care about is how information makes us feel. We want to be entertained. Thinking is hard. Feeling is easy. Who cares where this came from? It feels like it's from the 1980s, so now we deem it is. And when sharing information is easier than it's ever been, so too is a disregard for the truth. It's not that facts don't care about our feelings. Our feelings don't give a fuck about facts. The negation of history can lead to detrimental effects on groups of people who were impacted by past events. Couple that with the fact that humanity is more likely to spread information for reasons other than accuracy, and you have panic, you have fear, you have repeated perpetual injustice. Now, if this worries you as much as it worries me, that's a good thing. Luckily, there's a proven practice that allows for anyone to parse between fact and fiction. Next time you come across questionable information, think. That's it. Think. It's simple. So simple that I'm sure it sounds like I'm being facetious right now, but I am not. This is what those researchers at MIT found helped increase the quality of information spread. If you think critically and encourage others to do as well, then more accurate information is shared, leading to a more informed society overall. Understanding our presence, online or not, has consequences, influences how others think, how others feel, and how history is perceived. Maybe it's mistaking Outrun for actual 1980s, or maybe it's spreading hateful messages online. It's just as easy to do both and easier to do neither.